Well, thank you very much. It is an honor to be here. This is my first time in your beautiful country, and I'm just thrilled to be here and so excited. Thank you to everyone who made this happen and extended an invitation to me. So when I teach, it's very difficult to go in the post-lunch classroom because everyone's very sleepy. So now I know I have to compete against that tradition, and I have to compete against Harry Styles. So something tells me I cannot possibly win, but I'm going to do my best. What I want to do today, I'm a political scientist. And so what that means is that the lens that I use to view the world is probably different than other lenses that we've heard of. And for me, that is, as they say, a feature and not a bug. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a little bit about the way that I see these things in the hope that, that you will be exposed to something new, maybe not, and that I can learn from all of you during the question and answer phase. So I want to tell a couple of stories about the kinds of things that interest me and the kinds of things that I found. So I want to start off in the fall of 2011. In the fall of 2011, there's this earthquake that occurs in Turkey. It occurs in eastern Turkey, outside the city of Van. This is a city in a region of Turkey that has been exposed time and time again to earthquakes. So this is not a novelty for this area by any stretch of the imagination. But this particular quake is kind of a medium-sized quake. It's not a really small one. It's not the biggest one they've ever had. It's a medium-sized one. So you have this country that has experience with earthquakes, kind of medium-sized quake, and it still kills over 600 people. And so in the weeks that follow this particular event, we see a lot of articles written with headlines that look like this one. And if you follow the writing on disasters, this is not anything new. Anytime an event like this happens, we get this sort of outrage that's expressed, this kind of frustration that exists. And it's typified by this title, When Will the World Wise Up About Natural Disasters? This is something that I understand on a big level. It's the idea that what we have to be asking is this question, when are we going to learn? When are we finally going to get it through our thick heads and wise up? We have this area that is prone to a lot of disasters. We know that. Scientifically, and in terms of the science and the engineering behind it, earthquakes, we know quite a bit about the types of things that protect people and that limit or mitigate casualties. So it's frustrating. It's really frustrating. And I think it makes sense. It's a question that feels like the right question to be asking. But today I want to make the argument that it's actually the wrong question to be asking. Education is not the problem. It's a problem, but it's not the problem. And here's how I like to think about this. Imagine that we live in a world where everyone is educated on these issues, aware of these issues. I would venture to say that I think we would still have some of the problems that we would see. We'd still observe some of the poor outcomes that we observe. And that's because, for me, disasters are not a story about education or the lack thereof. Disasters are stories about incentives. They're stories about the way that rules and procedures create certain kinds of incentives for people to make choices in a particular way. And those choices aggregate into either good outcomes or bad outcomes. So in that sense, disasters are a social process just like other social processes we think about. So in any of the phases of disaster and emergency management, it's the particular mix of incentives that structure human decision-making that leads to the kinds of outcomes that we see. And it's these competing incentives that these are what make disasters political. Now, I don't think the fact that I say disasters are political surprises anyone in this room. Right? Everyone, I think, has an acute understanding of the fact that disasters are political events. But what's interesting for me is not the fact that they're political, it's the fact that despite disasters having what we perceive to be extraordinary consequences, and they often do, the underlying politics of disasters are in fact not extraordinary at all. the underlying politics are in fact quite ordinary. It's incentive-based tensions, that exist at any of the phases of emergency management. And these tensions are ones that exist in a whole host of social processes that are just plain hard. So what I want to do is tell a couple of brief stories, and they're stories that come out of my own research. And these are stories that are interesting because what they reveal is the idea of creating a kind of policy that's aimed at producing a certain kind of outcome, creating a set of incentives. And what actually winds up happening is something kind of counterintuitive. The policy produces an incentive to behave in the exact opposite way of what we might want. So unintended consequences is going to be the story of the day here. These stories are going to be twofold, and there are a number of examples I could pick out, but what I want to talk about is the tension that exists in one story between a strategy to try and produce affordable mitigation and a resulting moral hazard problem, and then the tension between trying to have a policy that encourages flexible response and one that also incentivizes short-term politics. So let's get going. So the first story I want to tell is about flood insurance in the United States. In the early 20th century, flood insurance in the United States is part of standard homeowners insurance policies. So people buy a homeowners insurance policy and it covers everything, including floods due to disasters. By the 1950s, the private insurance companies who are providing this flood insurance say, we've got a bit of a problem here. We are losing money on this. We're not taking enough money in on the insurance premiums to cover the money that's going out when we pay claims. The claims are too high. So by the late 1950s, early 1960s, private insurance companies actually stop providing flood insurance as part of their policy. So what happens? Well, you have average homeowners who now can't get flood insurance through private means, and they are on the hook when their homes flood due to disaster to cover the costs. And so increasingly, they're turning to the federal government. So a couple years later, the federal government says, this is not working for us. We're spending too much money on this. We have to find a way to encourage people and incentivize people to buy insurance. We think that's a good thing. So the federal government creates the National Flood Insurance Program. The National Flood Insurance Program attempts to incentivize people in the United States to buy insurance. It's provided by the federal government. And the way that they encourage people to buy this insurance is they provide it at a much lower cost than people would be able to afford on the market. So instead of pricing insurance the way normal private companies do, based on the level of risk involved, it heavily subsidizes the price. So in most cases, the price people pay for national flood insurance through the flood insurance program is 40 to 45% of what they pay on the private market. So they do this, and this seems like a good idea, right? We have this goal, we want to incentivize a nice mitigation strategy, which is create affordable insurance for people. But there's a problem, and it's a fundamental problem. And that's the fact that if we're really thinking hard about mitigating the consequences of flooding in the long term, there's a strategy that's even better over the long term. It's even better than insurance. And that strategy is move people out, relocate people, get people to make choices where they don't live in flood zones, where they don't live in places that flood repeatedly. So what's the problem here? The problem is basic economics tells us when you decrease the price of something, you're going to get more of it. So we've decreased the price of insurance. What's going to happen? People are going to buy more insurance. What does that mean? That means that it's now, if I'm a homeowner, cheaper for me to live than it otherwise would be in a flood zone. So you are incentivizing me to engage in the exact opposite behavior of what the goal of the policy is, right? Insurance is about mitigation, and that's part of the goal, but you're incentivizing me to move in the exact opposite direction. This is what we call a classic case of moral hazard. We have a rule that has a goal, and what we see is that it has this unintended consequence of producing an outcome that really runs counter to the goal. If nothing else, these two things are in tension with one another. So how does this structure the underlying politics of this? Every year, for 40 years or more, the flood insurance program comes up for renewal in the US Congress. So imagine that I am a homeowner and you are the congressperson, and I'm one of your constituents. So you're going to vote on this renewal. You have a choice between keeping the policy going, which gives me, a voter in your district, a short-term benefit, and it's a private benefit. I get that benefit. And you take the costs, which are public costs and long-term costs, and you kick them down the road. So that's one choice. The other choice that you have is to change or discontinue the insurance program. If you do that, you create a short-term cost for me. It's now more expensive for me to insure myself or to live in the area where I live, but you make a long-term benefit that's a public benefit. If we assume that you, as a politician, are like anyone else in the world, and that is that ultimately you would like to keep your job, you have an incentive to try and get reelected. And if you want to do that, what you do is you have an incentive to give me the short-term benefit. So we shouldn't be surprised that over the last 40 years, every year this has come up for a vote, it's passed with bipartisan support. One of the few issues that's had bipartisan support in the US Congress, especially in the last few years. And in the last 5 years, we can really see how the politics of this are particularly sticky. Around 2012, there was a movement in place in Congress to actually push back on this because the National Flood Insurance Program is broke. After Katrina and a number of other floods that occurred in the mid-2000s, they've paid out way more. They're in that same position that the private insurers were in 1950. So a number of congresspeople got together and said, we have to change this. We got to raise the rates back to what people would pay based on their level of risk. And they actually get it passed, called the Biggert-Waters Act in 2012. And almost immediately, rates skyrocket, especially for people in flood zones. And there's outrage, there is backlash. People who live in these zones see their flood insurance premiums double, triple, even more. And in most cases, in order to get a loan, a mortgage on a house in the United States, if you live in a flood zone, you have to have flood insurance. And again, this is the only game in town. So there's backlash. Backlash to such an extent that over the last 2 years, it culminates in what happens just a couple months ago in this, which I'll remind you if you don't know already, is a midterm election year in the US Congress, very important. They reverse course. They go back and they change their minds. And they say, we're going to go back to the subsidized rates because they decide that short-term affordability is more important than these incentives for long-term mitigation. And so you have folks like Senator Landrieu from Louisiana saying what we wanted was affordability, and we got it. So that's story number one. Again, an example of a situation where you have a rule designed to produce a particular outcome, and you create a set of incentives that, at least in part, go directly against that rule. Second example, flexible response and short-term politics. When a disaster happens all over the world, one of the first things that has to occur is some public official needs to make an official declaration of a disaster or a state of emergency, or in the case of the Philippines, a calamity. And all over the world, there are rules and procedures that dictate how this happens. And very often, that declaration is a triggering event. It's the event that sets in motion funding streams. It's the event that sets in motion a whole host of post-disaster response and recovery plans. So here in the Philippines, you have the National Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2010, and this sets up the idea that the National Disaster Risk Reduction Council advises the president, who at the national level has the ability to declare a state of calamity. There are similar procedures in place at the more localized levels as well that are dictated by this particular act. So on the one hand, this is good. In terms of disaster response, we like the idea that there's a certain amount of flexibility here. And the flexibility comes from the fact that you have a decision maker who has pretty wide discretionary power. And by that I mean that decision maker has the ability to decide what events are disasters and what aren't. Because we like the idea in terms of response when we can treat different disasters that happen at different times, different places, that affect different populations. We, in some ways, want to be able to treat those things differently. So, on the one hand, that's good. But this kind of thing also creates a short-term incentive for these discretionary decisions to become politicized. And in fact, we have research that shows in the United States that this is the case. So in 2011, this article was published by Andrew Reeves of Boston University. In the US, the president has wide discretionary authority to declare a disaster. And that triggers all sorts of federal and emergency management agency funding, FEMA funding, and a whole host of other kinds of processes. And what this particular study found was that if you live in a state, and this is going back and using historical data, if you live in a state that is competitive for national presidential elections, meaning where it's a close call, it's competitive, you are twice as likely to receive a disaster declaration as if you live in a state that's not competitive at all. So we've got the flexibility, which is great, but it sets up the idea that political incentives can come into play. And in recent research that I'm actually working on right now, I'm taking this idea and seeing if it applies around the world. So other countries have their own sets of rules and procedures, and some allow for a great amount of discretion for the decision maker, and other types of countries have rules and procedures that are much more defined. So this is what we think a disaster is, and that is kind of mandated by the legislature, and there's not a whole lot of wiggle room in terms of events that are disasters and aren't. So my question has been, what difference does that make? Do we see the same sort of politicization in countries that have discretion as we do in the United States? And the answers that I've found so far are yes. Places where you see a wide amount of discretion by the decision maker tend to have more politicized declaration processes. And again, these are the kinds of triggering moments for disasters and the procedures and the recovery procedures that follow them. So, whoops. I lost it. Thank you. So two stories here, a similar theme that underpins both. You have a rule, and the rule has good objectives in mind, sound disaster management objectives. But the problem is the rule incentivizes some behaviors that make the actual achievement of those objectives quite difficult. So what does this mean as we think about making good policy and if you're a journalist, thinking and writing about these issues, reporting on these issues going forward? I think we need to do a better job of thinking hard about and paying attention to unintended consequences of policies. Now, I realize that that idea is kind of an oxymoron. By definition, unintended consequences are unintended, implying that it may be very hard to see them in advance. But nonetheless, I think we need to get better on it. And I actually think that a lot of the crowdsourcing technologies that we've talked about today can help give us early insights about the way that people might respond to these different kinds of rules and help us think through what the aggregation of those responses look like. Social outcomes are the production of a whole host of individual choices and individual decisions that people make. So what we need to do is, I think, to get at these unintended consequences, dig deeper, and I didn't put it here, but dig smarter. If we're looking for potential solutions to these challenges, we have to look at underlying economic and political processes that are fundamental, that aren't just about disasters, that are about the way people make decisions and the way that those decisions aggregate into social outcomes. We need better stories about the way that that happens. We need better evidence, we need better data, all of which is going to help us think about the complicated ways that rules interact with incentives to produce the kinds of outcomes that we see, whether those outcomes are intended or whether they are unintended. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jason. Great